Okay, well, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining on our 1-year anniversary of these APSA Café events. Our monthly colloquium featuring cutting edge Anabaptist scholarship. So thank you so much for joining us and for continuing to participate. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge Andrea Wachtmansky, an integral member of our scholarship committee here and the one who manages the technology to make this event possible. Thanks, Andrea, for the work that you do. And for those of you joining us for the first time, we just ask that you save your questions for the end of the presentation or put them in the chat, and our presenter will be speaking for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then that should allow us lots of time for questions and discussion afterwards. For those of you who do participate in our discussion after the presentation, your questions and comments will be recorded, and those recordings will be available to our members on our newly designed website. And if you're not a member, the talk portion of the event will be publicly available. If you're joining by phone and would like to ask a question, please unmute by pushing the star and the numeral 6, and that should unmute you. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Yann de Waroux. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at McGill University and affiliated with the Institute for the Study of International Development. Dr. Polain de Waroux does fascinating research at the intersection of the social and the environmental, looking at how people use land for their livelihood. And he has traveled the globe, literally, from North Africa to South America, lots of places in between, to better understand resilience and adaptation in all of these different rural communities. And today he's going to be sharing with us more on the Mennonite expansion and their patterns of land use in Latin America. So thank you so much for joining us today and speaking with us about your research on how Mennonites are frontier land use agents of change out there. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and thanks to you and Andrea for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here and be able to talk about that research that I'm, as you'll see, I'm very passionate about, even though I will insist that I'm a complete tourist in the domain, and I hope you bear with me keeping that in mind. I will share my slides so that I can start. Okay, let's see. Okay, so my talk is, you can see the title there, right? Pious Pioneers. That's the name of an article that the first article that I wrote on the topic, and hopefully the first of many, about land use dynamics of Mennonites in Latin America. I want to acknowledge that this was made possible in part by the help of several research assistants who worked with me, Anna O'Driscoll, Janice Neumann, Kirsten Schreiber, Isabel Klassen-Marshall, and Lucia Strutzel at McGill, all great students who did some part of this work that you're gonna hear about today. So I will just start by saying a few more words about these things I do so that you understand where I'm coming from, because as I said, I consider myself a tourist in when it comes to Anabaptist or Mennonite studies. I come at this really from being very interested in process of land use change in agricultural frontiers. And it's a recent interest of mine that I've developed for these specific actors or agents of change that are the Mennonites in Latin America. So with that disclaimer, I'm generally interested in what people do with land and what implications that has for the environment and for development. And frontiers as places where agriculture, rangelands, croplands are expanding over natural or semi-natural areas, typically forests, Agricultural frontiers are very interesting to me for a number of reasons, but especially because they're places that present a great tension between different models of development and important trade-offs between environmental dimensions and social and economic dimensions. And so they've been an object, if you will, of study that's fascinated me for quite a while. And I've been studying dynamics of land use change at frontiers using a number of approaches, but at scales that vary from the very local to the regional and the sometimes continental, which is the case in what I'm going to talk today, and using a number of different kinds of methods, from using satellite imagery, which I will also talk about today, to analyzing interviews, transcripts, or statistical models and ethnographic methods. So I'm a little bit of a generalist in that sense, but all with a focus on land and land use change. And the way I come to this question of Mennonite land use change is through looking at land use change in the region that's called the Gran Chaco, which is a region some of you may be familiar with. It's not a region that's very broadly known, but increasingly so if you listen to environmental activists and all that, because it's a region with very drastic deforestation. And so it's a place, so expanding between Argentina, Paraguay, and Bolivia, as you can see on the map on the left, a place that's undergone very fast transformation from a woodland region inhabited by indigenous and mestizo people to a place dominated by ranch lands and soybean agriculture. So on the map at the center, you can see that process. In the darker red shade, darker green shade, you have what's mostly natural, semi-natural forests. Doesn't mean they're not being used, but they're used in a very, in a not very intensive way by small-scale farmers or forest households. And in red, you have places where that forest has been replaced very rapidly by agriculture. Red and brown. There's different shades there, and I don't need to go into that here, but that shows you those different fronts of advance of agriculture into those forests. Artistic depiction of that on the right by a Paraguayan indigenous artist, Clemente Julius. So all that's happening in the Chaco. And at the center of that, you've got in Paraguay these very large Mennonite colonies. Philadelphia or Fernheim, Neuland, Neuland, and then Meno or Loma Plata. So three towns that are also colonies that are really at the center of that expansion of agriculture in Paraguay. So as I worked on interviewing farmers to understand these dynamics of land use change, I came to talk to quite a number of Mennonite farmers who are part of that process to try to understand what they're doing, where they're purchasing land and expanding as part of that general expansion of agriculture. And talking to those people in Paraguay made me very interested in the story of these Paraguayan colonies, but also of other colonies and their role in those agricultural frontiers. And so, when you start talking to people there, you realize how important these colonies have been in the development of the region. For better or worse, if you will. I mean, it's been key to economic development, and also it's been central to the destruction of large amounts of forests as well. So there have been key participants in that, and not the only ones, but important ones. So that is in itself very, very interesting. And when you start looking a little bit beyond the case of the Paraguayan Chaco, you see that there is a continuous process of expansion and creation of new Mennonite colonies in Latin America. If you start looking, which I did, at news reports, for example. You see that in Peru, new colonies are being created in the Amazon. In Colombia, in the last few years, new colonies were created in the Llanos grasslands behind the Andes Mountains. In Argentina, you've got new colonies as well being created in the province of San Luis, for example. And so you see that sort of pattern of continuous expansion and emergence, both in places where Mennonites were already present, but also in completely new places, which to me, as someone who's interested in land processes, is extremely interesting and fascinating. And really, starting to think about that in a very casual way, I also noticed how little there is that's written about that process, especially information that's actually up to date. There's a fair amount of history of some of the older colonies in Mexico and Paraguay. People in these colonies have written a number of books about the origin of these colonies. So there is some interesting information. There's also a lot of interesting sociological and anthropological literature on some of these colonies. But in terms of getting a good overview of the general process of expansion and the land footprint of these colonies, there really wasn't very much. And so that just kind of prompted a, that just made me want to look into that and study that. And since then, that's developed into more of an actual research program, which I'll talk a little bit more about some of the things that I want to continue looking into. So the questions basically that I'm starting from here are pretty basic questions that just hadn't been addressed in the way, at least, that I addressed them here. So one is just how much land do Mennonites control and manage in Latin America, and where is it? Where are all these colonies? How many colonies are there? That was actually not so easy to answer. And then what kind of pathways have led to the current layout of these colonies in all these different countries? What colonies expanded with from where did people come from? Where did they go to afterwards? What led to what, if you would? Well, another question is, what are the causes of that expansion? I mean, we know that there's some demographic dimension, etc., but I'm particularly interested in how religious and cultural determinants might influence the creation of new colonies and also the choice of locations to settle. And I'll just take a second to apologize for street noise here. I'm on a relatively noisy street, so I hope that doesn't come through too much. So the causes of that expansion are also, I think, very interesting in their own right. For people studying land use, it's also something that has the cultural element in land use choices has been relatively overlooked in the community that maps big land use changes like agricultural frontiers. And so that's something that I was interested in exploring through the story of Mennonites in Latin America. And then lastly, I think there's really interesting questions to ask about what is the impact of these new colonies on their surroundings, not only in terms of removing forest cover, which is a relatively obvious one environmentally, but also do they influence the choices of other agents, agribusinesses, small-scale farmers around them, right? Do they influence them by maybe bringing new ways of doing, or by making it clear that it's possible to cultivate land in specific, often remote locations? So those are some key questions. A lot of them I haven't answered yet, so I hope you're not hoping to get answers on all that, because I'm still very much in the middle of thinking about all that and trying to answer some of these questions. But for the first two, I have some relatively formed answers. So I think probably a lot of you are quite familiar with this, but I do want to get over some very basic facts that are relevant here. And again, bearing in mind that this is coming from someone who's not intimately familiar with Anabaptist society and with Mennonites, but has just recently developed an interest for this. So the Mennonites that you'll find in Latin America are mostly people who can trace their origins to the 16th century in Western Europe and speak Low German to this day. Of course, a lot of people also speak Spanish, a lot of people also speak English, but Plattdeutsch, Low German, is mostly the language of choice. And some of the things that are, I think, really relevant when thinking about land here is that they hold to certain religious and cultural principles very dearly. And those are being separated from the world, from worldly things. And I think that's something that would, a theme that would be very familiar in generally in Amish and Anabaptist studies. And rejection, a certain rejection of nation states, of course, a selective rejection, of course. Pacifism, attachment to farming, that is very relevant when thinking about land. And then having your own education system, preferably in German or Low German. So this set of criteria contributed to multiple migrations. I'm not going to oversimplify that story, but people moved from Eastern Europe and Russia to North America and Latin America. In the case of Mennonites in Latin America, the main pathway was people moving to Canada, and then from Canada to Mexico and Paraguay, and then to some other places, and then from Mexico and Paraguay expanding to other countries. That's kind of the main route, but not the only one. You have some people who moved from the USSR to Paraguay, and I'll come back to those pathways briefly later. So those original colonies were people in Canada who were dissatisfied with some of the changes around them, including pressure to observe the military service, pressure to follow education in English, and generally the sense that society was changing and being more anglicized around them, and decided to move and find a new place to go. And so a lot of these people went to northern Mexico. Some of them also went to Paraguay, to the Chaco. So that's very, very briefly the general story of how people came to be in Latin America. Now, what I'm mostly going to talk about here is the effort of tracing these colonies and some of the results that come out of that. So I've used everything I could find basically to answer these first questions of where are these colonies, how much land do they have, who went where at what time. Okay, so existing books written about these colonies, maps, and a lot of information was taken also from a newsletter, which I'll mention in a minute. So, you know, I had to find information about for each colony, well, the names of all the colonies in existence, and then when they were created, who were the ones creating it, not so much names, but where they came from, and then some information about its area, its location, and why did people go there. Sometimes that information was available, sometimes it wasn't. So I looked at these history books. The good thing about Mennonites, I think in general and in Latin America in particular, is that a lot of people have written about the history of their colonies, especially in the older, more established colonies in Paraguay and Mexico. They've written books, multiple books, sometimes about a single colony. And so there's a lot of wealth of information there that I could find, thankfully. And also there's a sizable academic literature that I could draw from. The other amazing thing is that in several of these countries, there are some mapping enthusiasts that have created pretty accurate maps of colonies. And so in Mexico, for instance, I was in touch with a person who created really good maps that just needed a little bit of updating. And then some of the colonies in Paraguay, for instance, produce their own maps for the purpose of administering their colony. There are some older atlases that are not up to date, but at least give you something to start from. So I use all of that. And the other priceless document is the Mennonite Host, which is a newsletter, a bi-monthly newsletter sent out of Steinbach, Manitoba, to even the most remote colonies, either in electronic or paper form. And it carries a lot of news, reader letters, and very up-to-date news on what's going on in a lot of these colonies. And so I basically kind of had some students go through a lot of that, did some of it myself too, and also got in touch with the editor. And from that, we got a lot of the more up-to-date recent information on what's going on in these Latin American colonies, what's the latest. And it's surprisingly thorough in terms of covering a lot of what's going on there. So I'm worried I'm going a little slow. I'm gonna try to speed up without speeding up too much. So in conjunction with that, I also, of course, use satellite imagery, which is something I generally do in my work. And so one of the ways to do that is simply going to Google Earth, because it actually has a history function that's very, very useful in this case. And it really shows you over time how colonies have evolved. And sometimes you can identify, for instance, the beginning of development of a colony, such as this one here in Bolivia. You can see on the left that it's barely starting in 2011, and then 2022, it's a fully formed colony on the right. So all of that together allowed me to produce a map of all known to me colonies in Latin America, and I'm pretty confident that I didn't miss any colonies, or at least any major ones. And so you see that map on the left. I'd have to zoom for you to see it better. I'll show zoom in later on Bolivia. And then there's a full table with each colony and some information on that. So that's the sort of the how, right? And so to start answering the questions I was asking, the first question was, how much land do Mennonites actually control and manage in Latin America? And there I could put a number on that. It's relatively precise. Of course, it doesn't take into account certain things. It's only land within colonies. Mennonites in a place like Paraguay, for instance, often also own land privately outside of colonies. That's not reflected here. But land in the colonies amounts to about 4 million, a bit under 4 million hectares. That's about 8 million acres. That's a lot of land. And I think to put it in more concrete terms, it's a bit more than the area of the Netherlands, which I think is a striking fact when you consider that a majority of these people can trace their origins to Friesland, in between Holland and Germany. And yeah, the fact that they've kind of come to manage an area greater than the Netherlands, I think, is very significant. The bubbles you see on the left, very briefly, the lighter bubbles are older colonies, and the darker bubbles are newer colonies. And bigger represents more land. So you see that Paraguay in pink red is probably the country with the most land controlled by Mennonites overall. And then you have Mexico and Bolivia in similar amounts. And within Paraguay, you can see that there's 3 really large bubbles, and those are the 3 colonies in the Chaco region that I started out talking about. So you can see why I got interested in the influence of Mennonites on land use, because that's where I started, in these huge colonies that are almost kind of a state within the state in Paraguay. So you see a diversity of sizes and also ages in these colonies in that little plot there. And the second question I had was what these pathways are that led to the current state of affair. And so very briefly here, and you can go through the paper that's referenced there. It's actually no longer under review. I should have updated that on the lower right. But the first movement was from Canada to northern Mexico, and then you had a number of other international movements. I'm only representing here international movements at different dates. So Canada to Paraguay, but also Soviet Union to Paraguay, to Uruguay, to Brazil, and then a lot of arrows going from Mexico to other places, so from Mexico to Bolivia, to Argentina, to Colombia more recently, to Brazil even. So a lot of international movements to create new colonies. Another way I've represented this, and bear with me, this I'm gonna start simple and then it's gonna get complex. Is through this plot. I thought a lot about how to represent this spread from one colony to another in while representing the whole of all Latin American colonies. So I ended up with this. It's the best I could do. It's still a little complex. This is a plot showing a timeline on the left. So lower is older, is the early 20th century. And a bar represents one colony. And so this is the colony of Nuevo Ideal in Durango in Mexico. And this shows that it started out early on. I didn't put the numbers here just to not overload the plot, and persisted through the present day, right? So the gray bar goes all the way up. So it's been in existence all that time. What I tried to do here is to plot different colonies and their relationships. So here you have another colony, Yann in Campeche, which is a more tropical area. Durango is a pretty desertic area of northern Mexico. Campeche is in the Yucatan Peninsula, and it's very subtropical. And so you had a movement after many years of people from Nuevo Ideal who were looking for more land to expand and got wind of land being sold in Campeche, went there. It's relatively far for them, but found that that place was interesting and moved to Yann, created a new colony. People later moved to another place in Campeche, and you have many more such lines linking that colony to other colonies. So that's the case for each line, right? Each colony typically led to other colonies as people, the number of people grew and they were looking for more land. So now is where it gets complex. I'm adding all the colonies and all the lines. Okay, so if it's overwhelming, don't worry about it. But each horizontal line is tying a colony, a so-called mother colony, with a so-called daughter colony, right? So a colony of origin where people moved from on the black end of the line, and on the orange end of the line, a colony where people moved to. So that's what you've got represented here. And so you can see a lot of horizontal lines, first of all. And if you look at the first ones on the left, some of the original Mexican colonies, you can see that they've created a lot of offshoots. There's a lot of lines connecting them to other gray bars, other colonies in Mexico, but also in Belize, in Paraguay, and Bolivia. So that's the first fact that kind of comes out of this, right? You can see all these lines, these original colonies really expanded outwards. You can see other things, such as, you have very old colonies in Brazil and Uruguay, again, from people from the USSR mostly, that didn't really produce very many offshoots. They didn't end up expanding the same way. And then if you look at Bolivia, for instance, you've got a huge number of new colonies, a very progressive creation of colony year by year, as you can see. And a lot of that is endogenous. A lot of these lines are just linking Bolivian colonies to other Bolivian colonies. So to zoom in on Bolivia for a minute, because Bolivia is very interesting. Here's a map zooming in on that area, and what you see is lighter shades are older colonies, and darker shades in red are younger colonies. So in the last 10 years or so. So from the first colony in the 50s, today you have about 90 colonies, which is a whole lot of colonies. covering over 1 million hectares, so 2 million acres, more or less, and totalizing about 50,000 people. So it's a really drastic expansion. The way it went was that you first had a few people from the Paraguay and Chaco colonies who were not very happy with some of the changes in these colonies, which is often the story. In this case, one of the beefs they had was with the creation of a cooperative structure that they thought was too rigid. So people moved and created some new colonies in Bolivia, in the lowlands. This was pretty marginal in terms of the total area, and some of these colonies didn't last very long, didn't create many offshoots, but still it established a precedent for the presence of Mennonite colonies in Bolivia. The big change came when Mexican Mennonites from Chihuahua in the north of Mexico, so some of the original Mexican colonies, were looking to expand. They were getting running out of land up there in Mexico and looking to expand, and so they probably looked at or definitely looked at the precedent of some people having settled in Bolivia and sent a delegation to look for land and ended up acquiring large amounts of land in Bolivia, and that was kind of what set off the more massive expansion of Mennonites in Bolivia. And later you had more waves of immigration from Paraguay, especially from the more conservative colonies in the east of Paraguay, and also influx of people from Canada, a little bit, not that much, but some people came directly from Canada and from Belize as well. Because I'm a geographer, I'm interested in the geographic patterns of expansion and land change. So if you look at how things evolved over time, you see a few directions of expansion here. You have a direction towards the east, which was driven partly by people moving from outside of Bolivia, but also partly by people in Bolivia just looking to expand because they were running out of land in the original colonies. You see one fleck that's kind of white here, and I'll show, I think, an image, zoom in on that one later. That's a colony created in '75 by people from Belize at a point where there was no agriculture anywhere near there. It was extremely isolated. And you have a direction of expansion towards the south, which originally was indigenous, but then people from eastern Paraguay, from Argentina, from northern Mexico came. Northeast, you have a whole new cluster from the last 10 to 20 years, completely from indigenous growth, just people running out of land and setting up shop in what's the Chiquitanía region, a dry forest region in the northeast. And then you have a last set of colonies being created really far away towards the Amazon. In the grasslands of the Beni and then towards the Amazon. So I'm I think already towards the end of my time, but if that's okay, I'll try to take another 5 minutes and go relatively fast over the rest. Is that okay, Natalie?
That's fantastic. Yes, thank you.
Okay, good. I didn't really time this, so I was hoping it would fit, but continuing on the question of patterns, so these are sort of the mapping and geographic patterns of expansion. What I've increasingly been also interested in, and I'm hoping to further pursue if I get some funding that I've asked for, that's one of the contingencies, is to understand better how colonies and people from colonies find land to expand and create new colonies. I've worked a fair amount with agribusiness actors, so big, business people buying land, and I understand more or less how they acquire land. But Mennonites are different in several respects, in the fact that culture and religion play a big role in the decisions they make, and so I'm really curious to understand better how they go about finding new land, and also whether that has changed over time. So in the past, we know that a pattern was often that a colony, for instance, in Mexico, would send a delegation composed of the leader, the foster of the colony, and other people to find land. They would find a broker and also negotiate with the government, possibly to see some accommodations for their religious requirements, and so that was historically how it was done, but it's not entirely clear that this is still how things are done. And one reason that I'm interested in this is that there seems to be a really interesting intersection between agribusiness and Mennonite colonies. For all the differences that you have between those types of actors, you find interesting overlaps. So the image you have there, actually, the guy with a red hat is an Argentine land broker who operates mostly in Bolivia. He's been there a long time, and he's sold land in the forest land to be deforested in frontiers to a lot of actors, Argentines, Brazilians. He's also done land deals in Africa. He's a very successful land broker. And he's positioned himself in the last few years as a go-to for Mennonites looking to expand. And that's what you see on this promotional image here, that he's kind of showing the way to these Mennonites in Bolivia. And he's been bringing groups of Mennonites even outside of Bolivia to a place like Suriname, for instance, to look for land. So that's a fascinating process, and those intersections I'm hoping to explore more in the future. Unfortunately, I don't have much to say on that yet, but hopefully in a few years. So briefly on the causes, because I'm out of time, definitely, but thinking in terms of push and pull, like in migration studies, you can kind of break down why people create new colonies into production reasons and reasons that have to do with cultural preservation. Production, people run out of land because communities expand, and so they will look for new land. That's a pretty straightforward reason. There's also often, if you review the reasons why people moved, especially in the case of Mexico, for instance, questions of climate and drought that have been prominent in people trying to move away into wetter areas. And then when they look for a place and they end up in Peru or Bolivia, you can see that accessibility to some extent to markets is going to be important because people want to market their products. And also finding large amounts of land for cheap is a huge factor, because you want a large amount of land so that you can accommodate some amount of demographic growth over the next decades. Otherwise, you're going to have to find new land again to form a new colony far away, and that's not ideal. And then in cultural terms, you have extremely prevalent the question of fleeing what's perceived as increasing worldliness, either within the colony, and we could go into that more in the discussion, but people adopting new technologies within the colony, and some people disagreeing with that and deciding to move on. Sometimes threats to the what's called the privilegium, the privileges granted to Mennonite communities in terms of education, so special their own education in terms of military service, and not having to do sworn oaths and things like that. And so when the governments start turning and start questioning those agreements, some people also tend to leave. And then you have schisms within some communities with new churches appearing or churches changing and people going away often to have a more pure version of their faith. And that leads people to often settle in very, very remote places, which is what's particularly interesting from a land use and a frontier land use standpoint. So here are two examples. You've got the one created, Nueva Esperanza, created by Belizean farmers in Bolivia in the 70s. That was a full 170 miles from the next city and almost as far to the closest agricultural land. And in Peru, very recently in 2016, it started being developed a set of new colonies 140 miles into the Amazon from Pucallpa, which is the first city. So really remote areas. And the reason for that is partly cultural preservation. So with that, there are questions about, okay, but not all colonies are the same. So do we see that colonies that are especially conservative will be the ones settling in these very remote places? Do they do things differently than the more modern colonies? So in Argentina, for instance, new colonies being created are created by people from Chihuahua who have adopted a bunch of new technologies that are rejected by other colonies. Do they do things differently once they settle there? And how does that influence their surroundings? And more generally, and that's what I'm going to conclude with because I'm way over time, how do these colonies that settle in these remote places influence what's going on around them? So do we see that once a colony settles in a remote forest, other actors will start gravitating around that? And talking to large-scale farmers that are not Mennonites, I've heard repeatedly how they really like being close to Mennonites for various reasons, because they develop roads, because they provide services, because they show examples of agricultural experiments that lead the way in some ways. So I'm going to be asking those questions in future research. And I'm going to leave there. I had a slide with conclusions, but thank you very much. Sorry about going way over time, but I hope we have still a little bit of time for questions.